Welcome to Life Expansion After 50. Today I have the first part of a three-part series on the topic of taking charge of your own agency, as in personal leadership. The premise is that you can have all the personal leadership in the world, but it won't do you any good if you can't access it. Now, you have to access personal leadership to live through your own agency. Once you give up personal leadership, once you give up agency, then all bets are off in terms of you living out your life design towards your own vision. Now, this is even more difficult for people over 50, in my opinion, when compared to someone that's in their 30s. Why? Because most adults are living out their lives 95% by habit. Now, if you do this year after year, by age 50, you're so much more experienced at running your habits than the 30-year-old. If for no other reason, that's what makes it harder. But the other thing is we've ingrain those neural pathways over and over and over, running the same patterns, telling ourselves the same story over and over, to where even though it doesn't make sense, and maybe it never made sense, when it comes to a topic like life expansion, you have to overcome limiting beliefs, which is difficult because of cognitive biases like confirmation bias, anchoring bias, and recency bias. Just to name a few. I actually did a study on cognitive biases and came up with almost 36 that actually impact us in terms of whether sales or leadership or pursuing our goals. I had to change direction because trying to understand 36 or communicate 36 different cognitive biases was a non-starter. So what I've shifted to is, instead of worrying about all the different cognitive biases, focusing on the principles that, when followed, the cognitive biases don't come into play. That's a more practical approach to it. Now, I'll touch on these cognitive biases today just for positioning. Keep in mind there are a lot more, and everybody's different, and so those cognitive biases are going to have different impacts and different effects. When I start talking about taking charge of agency, we have to start with conditioning and why we do the things that we do. Now, most people are probably aligned with the idea that 95% of everything we do is done by habit. What we don't think about, though, or what I don't see happening, is that people living out their lives making decisions based on that fact. So we may know that 95% of everything we do is done by habit, but when you look at how we live our lives, how we make decisions, just the thought of, well, if we just tell them again, if we just communicate it better, they'll know. Well, if 95% is done by habit, I don't care how many times you communicate it, until you make that a habit, you're probably not going to see the behavior change that you want. And this is what frustrates a lot of times business owners, because they're moving so fast and they don't recognize that they're not actually hearing what the person is saying, or they're not observing what's actually going on, and they're working on getting something to be done, but it's counter to what the person's habits are. We've got that, and what makes it worse is that the 95% of our habits were formed largely from age 0 to 7, not all. And then during the teenage years, it's sort of like we make that our personality. We do some trial and error, and those habits start to become our point of view, because next, from about 19 to 27, we get the prefrontal cortex fully formed. And that prefrontal cortex, for lack of a better term, sort of locks in all that conditioning and makes it our model of the world. What's interesting is things like willpower, which has some cousins of I don't want power and I won't power. And those are self-control mechanisms that go with willpower, but they can actually get in our way when they're in conflict. We may want to go east, but if we've somehow decided between 0 to 7 or during our teen years that going east was bad, then even though we're trying to go east, we're getting in our own way. This is what people think of as self-sabotage sometimes. When you're trying to go after a goal, but you keep stopping yourself, you're arguing for your weaknesses. A lot of times it's the I don't want power. So you have to understand that. But I bring it up because these are in the prefrontal cortex. So because of that, we didn't have them before 19, largely. By age 30, they're fully in play, which is why it seems to be a lot harder to live by willpower after 27 or 30 than it was before. So anyway, so we've got the 0 to 7 is our habits. And then what happens is we end up moving toward things or away. And of course, we move away from things that we think might hurt us, and we move toward things that would gain pleasure. This is no rocket science. But what I want to point out is you can think of it as we have this meter, and let's call this 2.5 on a scale of 10. This is 7.5, 2.5, and that's 10. So let's call this a meter. It's a stress meter. Because in order to have agency and personal leadership, we have to understand what's getting in the way of us using it. We already have the capability, but we're not accessing it. So rather than try to add more personal leadership and add more knowledge and add more information, what we want to do is focus on removing the barriers and obstacles. If you have a stressor that's under 2.5 on a scale of 10, so 10 would be life and death, Serengeti tiger, 10 of them coming at you at one time. That's a level 10 stressor. Most of us don't have more than one level 10 stressor in a lifetime. Some people have multiple level stressors in a lifetime. If you've been in combat or whatever, or you've been in a war area that's in war, obviously you're going to have more of those high stressors. But for most of us in business, those stressors are not hitting level 10, but we may interpret them as level 10. So I think everyone would agree that any stressor that's under 2.5, we have full access to our agency. If you have a stressor that's between 2.5 and 5.0, you probably maintain your agency in most cases. You're probably able to manage that. It's not a threat. But then when we get up to above 5 as a stressor, we start seeing some survival reaction kick in. And then once you get above 7.5 to 10, of course, this is just an illustration just to make the point, you have a much harder way to go in terms of the stress response. You're now up at a level 10. What happens is your field of vision closes in. It's just like you've ever played paintball, you may have, or been actually in combat, you probably experienced that red mist that happens when you're getting shot at and you're focused on trying to survive and your vision closes in. It's all about survival. You're into that fight or flight stress response. You got the cortisol going through your body. You got the adrenaline coming in. And all of that limits our resourcefulness in other areas. And this is what happens when you're focused on a threat that's not really a threat sometimes in business. It's not really a threat. It's just an inconvenience or it's just a change. But if you see it as a threat, all your forces can go there. So this hurts in terms of our agency. So that's the first one I wanted to point out. And what we want to do is we want to live in this kind of space even when it's up here. So we don't want to have the red area. We want to have green, and obviously there's need for caution, but you want to have access to your agency at all times. You don't want to be running into this survival reaction, especially given the fact that we're not usually encountering anything like a Serengeti tiger. So what I'm talking about here is survival reactions. You heard people being triggered. And the way I'll illustrate that is you have a stimulus, and people are familiar with stimulus response. I actually break it down a little bit more because it's important. This is an important area. This is a part of, in order to gain agency and control in terms of your personal leadership, this is an important area to understand. It's happening between the stimulus and response. What's interesting is this can be as a few milliseconds. That reaction can be a few milliseconds. You've seen it. Somebody sees something that they're deathly afraid of, and they react before they even have a chance to think about it. The conscious mind has a reaction time of about 0.2 of a second, and the unconscious, it's all about energy, and that energy flows very quickly. So literally in single-digit milliseconds, you can already be reacting. So I call it, instead of stimulus response, I call it stimulus reaction response. And in that reaction is also meaning. So we want to have that taken care of. And then after the response, we have decision and action. So I'm going to say you got the stimulus, and then you have somewhere that's measured in milliseconds. Could be 100, 200, 0.2 of a second. And then you have reaction, you have response, you have decision, and you have action. Usually, when it's in that red mist zone, people don't have all of these as steps. It's just one thing. The stimulus, then they get a reaction as response, a decision, and an action all at once, and they're off and running. So what you end up having is you have a small S stimulus and a huge R reaction. And this is what we have to manage. We have to manage the space between the stimulus and the R which with in normal cases is everything. It's the reaction and the response. And what we want to do is have the stimulus, we want to have the pause, and then we want to have a proper response based on that. And this pause doesn't have to be long. We're talking seconds, less than seconds, tenths of a second. But that's the point. Once you can manage your reaction and your response, now you're going to start having more of your agency because you're not getting triggered. That's the whole point here. We don't want to get triggered. When you can avoid, and you've seen enough videos now that, social media, what have you, YouTube, news, there's so many examples, whether it's law enforcement or somebody who's threatened or someone in an unfamiliar situation or somebody whose boundaries have been crossed, their rules have been broken, and people get triggered because a broken rule could mean to them, that could have meaning that there's imminent danger. So that was the stress meter. I've got the survival reaction. Again, the context here is life expansion after 50. And in order to lean into that expansion and get past the limiting beliefs, we first have to figure out what's causing us to be triggered. So if you look at my content, I often talk about this zone. This is our comfort zone. And we have an upper limit and we have a lower limit. I would argue that these limits are governed by fear. In other words, you don't want to drop below this comfort zone. When you drop below that comfort zone, bad things happen in your mind and in reality as well. And so fear makes us take action. This is that thing where somebody might be going along, it's just not happening, they're not getting the work done. Deadlines, right? And then all of a sudden they get close to the deadline, suddenly they're motivated to do this thing. Fear does that. And then above the line, I would say that it's fear as well. But people don't like to think of it as fear because fear is the negative. And so we call it ambition. And I'm all for healthy ambition. I'm not suggesting anything is wrong with that. But ambition, because it's fear-based, as we get into that ambition, we do start running into the basics of fear, the underlying aspects of it. If you think about, if I instead say greed, right, which is a worse form of ambition, it's easier to see that greed is fueled by fear. This creates a barrier for us. So if you think about dropping below the line, it's a line, you drop below the line and you have bad things happen, you've got to recover. When you go above the line, not only do you have the fear, but this is all unknown. And the unknown creates a whole nother element. The unconscious does not like the unfamiliar. When you get into the unfamiliar, it's scary because it catastrophizes. We know what it's like falling below the line, and we can imagine it. There's enough examples, tangible things. But when it's going above the line, as we start going above this line here and into this scary zone, we get what's called cognitive dissonance, and that cognitive dissonance causes anxiety. As anxiety and excitement have the same signature. Even if you're excited about it, that could come in as anxiety. Anxiety has associations to other things that have gone bad, and next thing you know, you're dropping back down again. And that's why we end up in that comfort zone. And you can literally look at your life and see that you've made the same mistakes repeatedly. And I'm not saying we've lived in the same exact level, but you can see that you've tried things and it just haven't been able to get past those areas. You haven't been able to solve some things, repeat the same mistakes, and we're in that comfort zone up and down. Not everybody, obviously, but I'm drawing a picture that helps you to see when you combine it with that fear meter. Both of these, we're going to get into that red zone. And both of these, we're getting into fear zone. And once you're in the fear zone, you have less access to your personal leadership. And without personal leadership, you don't have the agency. I like to keep these under 20 minutes. So next week, I'm going to talk about how this applies with the cognitive biases. And I'll get into the doors that are open to us today that were not opened in the past. The doorways that were open in the past and are still open, but in the past, they were not available to us. And we'll look at it in that context to start laying the groundwork for that self-actualized life, which can happen above the line. And that's what it's about. If you're 50, you probably have more than half of your adult life ahead of you. And we can continue to live that life based on survival, or we can turn it around and start living based on thriving. And I say that to do that, you want to be connected to your purpose, because the purpose is big enough to cross this barrier. And self-actualization is rewarding enough, intrinsic rewarding, to keep you going. So we'll pick up next week. The next episode will be a part 2, and I'll get into the cognitive biases, and relative to the opportunities. We'll see you then.